So it got kind of out of hand. And it wasn't necessarily the banks that got totally out of hand. It was the shadow banking system that got totally out of hand. They were just acting in an agency capacity. So basically, you'd go up, you'd give a homeless guy a previously, approved mortgage application, you put it back in your briefcase, and then you'd sell it off into Wall Street or tranche it up, make it a CDO, do something of that nature. And so there became this voracious securitization appetite to get everybody a mortgage. And so, as I said, we created this shadow banking industry. And this is a really important slide. I'll tell you, I got the data for this from a speech that Tiny Tim Geithner, our new Treasury Secretary, wrote when he was... And if any of y'all know Tim, I apologize, but I'm kind of mad at him right now. And so I'm going to continue to use Tiny Tim unless you tell me not to. And so he sized the traditional banking environment. He sized the shadow banking environment when he was running the New York Fed, and he gave a speech, and I sucked the elements out of it. Basically, what he was saying was we've got a traditional banking system that is regulated. It has a federal safety net, and it's about $10 trillion. But behind that, we've created this shadow financial services business that's also $10.5 trillion, but it's unregulated, and it has no federal safety net, right? Think about Lehman Brothers. Well, what is this shadow banking industry made up of? $2 trillion worth of hedge funds, $2.2 trillion of off-balance sheet vehicles. Basically, that's all the alphabet soup you hear, the CDOs, the ABSs, the CMBSs, that's all that stuff. And then the repo market, which was a synthetic overnight lending market, was another $2.5 trillion. The investment banks themselves were about $4 trillion, and the insurance companies couldn't leave well enough alone. They got in the game, and they created a credit default swap marketplace, which was $65 trillion. Well, that was also unregulated, no federal safety net, and again, $65 trillion in notional value, which makes it sound bigger than it is, but it's still pretty scary stuff. Okay. Then you can take a look at these two systems and say, where was the leverage? Well, here's your traditional banks. And that's how much leverage they were using between 2001 and 2008 because they were regulated, right? They have 10% reserve requirements. So for every, dollar they get in, they can loan out 9. They keep, 10% in reserves. Shadow banking industry, just the investment banks, they were leveraged up to about 30, 33 times. Now, it doesn't take much for your collateral to decline when you are levered that high with, and not become insolvent. And so that is exactly what happened. This is household debt and delinquency or default going all the way back to 2000. You can see, this was a nice world. Housing prices were rising, consumers were paying their bills, and then they got over-levered and started to default. And when that happened, because these businesses were so heavily levered, it didn't take much to tip them over. This is a chart of the TED spread, which is basically the difference between the overnight lending rate for the government and the overnight lending rate between banks. And anytime it gets wide, that means the banks don't trust each other. Not a good thing. Well, you can see as we got into that period of kind of mid-July, that was sort of the breaking point. That was when 2 of those hedge funds failed at Bear Stearns. That freaked the market out. Consumers continued to increase their delinquency ratios, and we just kind of move on through the process of failure. And so where is the shadow banking system today? It took me a while to get this data. Assets in the hedge fund industry are down 48% according to Trim Tabs. The off-balance sheet vehicles, well, that's the stuff the government's trying to figure out whether they should buy or not, or nationalize, right? That's the toxic stuff you read about. Well, that's trading anywhere from really 0 to call it 95 cents on the dollar. Nobody knows what that stuff's really worth. And the repo market is kind of frozen. The investment banks, well, they're gone. Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, they're gone. Merrill Lynch is now Bank of America, which is at threat of being nationalized. And Goldman and Morgan Stanley are now traditional banks, and they're selling off assets as quickly as they can. The credit default swap marketplace, AIG, gone, right? The biggest insurer on the planet. So the collapse of the shadow banking industry is really the story. Traditional banks lend about 22% of the credit that's available out there. This is the problem. And this is what the Fed is trying to fill in terms of a void. And we're really good at distributing stuff too. And so this is a chart that shows you the connections between us and our major financial trading partners. Pretty fat pipe to Europe, pretty fat pipe to the UK, pretty fat pipe to Japan. If you pick up the Wall Street Journal tomorrow morning, what you read about the banks in Europe and the UK and Japan and the US is all the same because they were trading with each other. Notice my friends in emerging Asia really aren't that connected to us in the financial services way. And so they avoided a lot of this stuff, even though they were the ones that sent us the money and we went bananas with it. So really it's just as simple as that. We had the emerging markets that had changed strategy, created a whole bunch of dollar reserves, lent it back to us. We had a very easy monetary policy, thank you Mr. Greenspan, between 2003 and 2005. We had vastly underestimated risk in the financial markets, and that was really a failure at the top of each of these investment banks. And then we had failures of corporate governance, a la Fannie and Freddie. We had households saving way too little and borrowing way too much, so we're guilty too. And then you had the federal guns and butter agenda. So all of that interreacts, and you get a housing crash, a stock market crash, a financial crisis that eventually drips down into a recession, which is where we are now.